Yes, so we were reviewing the anatomy of Express.js, and what we did so far was we imported the module that was necessary. We created an instance of it, and now we are going to build our Node.js application by referring back to this instance. And by instance, I mean this variable called app that is calling our Express module. All right. So again, with Node.js HTTP servers like we created in week 4, the restriction is that you can just have that one page that's created, that one output that we see. Okay. And to help with that, we are going to use the Express.js framework this week. All right. And create different routes. Okay. The first route that you always must create, and that's again standard syntax, is your default route. So when you do run this code, when you do run your server.js file, what's the first page that the user should be able to see? So that route is signified or called upon by using this forward slash. Okay, so forward slash means that's the home route. We are not referring to any other page. So when you call the app instance, which is your Express module, and you define this route, in response, currently we are sending back. So response, we're sending back this message that says hello world. So that is our main route. So when no path is specified in our link, you're just going to be calling our main default route. So let's create that in the project folder that we were seeing today. So you have been provided with that already. Okay, so this was just for instance. I can remove the HTTP module. What we do require is the Express module. We created an instance of it, and now we are using this app variable to create our main route that will be called upon when no path is specified, which means if we run server.js as is, okay, in our Node.js environment, and if I go back to my browser and simply type either 127.0.0.1 and then the port name that follows, or the easier way to do this, just simply type localhost 3000, and you'll see the response that we have in our main homepage. So this, I'm going to minimize this. This is the route, or this is the response that we are seeing by default, and default is written as such. And if you want to call upon the host and you don't want to type in 127.0.0.1, then the equivalent version of that is just typing localhost and then using this port that we've defined. Okay. On that note, you may have noticed that in the code that you have been provided today, it doesn't directly say const port equals 3000. It says process.env.port. And what this means is either run this code, okay, use this port that we have here, or let the port be 3000. What that means is when we do host today's code on AWS, if AWS already has some predefined, or if in our settings we specify a port number, then just use that has already been provided. And if that's not the case and we're just testing it out locally, then the port number should be 3000. And that way, when we simply search for local host, the port that our application is currently running on is 3000. Okay. So that is what this means. And so in this way, we have created our first main home route using our Express.js framework. Okay. And again, I said this is our main route. What if we want to create more routes and multiple pages? And that's exactly why we are using Express. So let's create other routes. Um, Last week we did pass on a JSON object from one place to another file. We passed in from our server.js file to app.js, and we saw how our index.html page showed us that response. Now this time around, if you want to pass a value, okay, or if you want to display a dynamic page, we can create a route for that by passing in a certain value in the URL itself. So the second route that we are examining right now, okay, we're calling the Express instance again. And instead of defining a default route, we have created a route called name. So if you go to localhost 3000/name, you will be redirected to this page. However, you won't see the complete response, okay, because this page is also expecting a variable called key. Now, what this means is in this route, when we do search for localhost 3000/name, this colon over here means we are expecting a value also to be provided. Okay, so when you directly have some string that is there right after a forward slash, that is your root name. But before that string, if you have a colon, it means when you're trying to access this root, the value that follows after the colon is supposed to basically be a variable. So we are going to pass a name, okay, in this case, and key is the variable that's going to hold that name for us. So when this root does get rendered, we are going to print out hello. And then this is how you would print out a variable in Node.js. So now we'll use the request parameter. Okay, so we'll use the request parameter from our function, use the params keyword, and get the variable that is called key from our URL. Okay, and we'll print that out as a response. So that way, if I print out, if I call the localhost name root and I print out Jenny or Martin or Ragvi or Trini or anything, it'll say hello and then your name. Okay, so we have a little more flexibility when using this route. So as always, I have tried to provide this PDF which walks you through everything that we're just going over right now. So I'll switch to multiple screens. Okay, so we did see how we can simply print out hello world and how we can run that application. Now we are trying to create this route, setting up dynamic routes. So let's define that. Back again in our server.js file, right after you have your default route. Okay, so if no other route is called, then you'll simply see this default route that gives us a response hello world in return. Right after that, we'll call the express instance again, right? So app.get, okay? Get is a way for us to, it's a method, okay? Uh, since we are just providing a response and not really expecting a value besides the value that's coming from our URL, we are not really having a form submission to deal with. So we're just going to use the get method for a few weeks. So app.get name, that's what our route is going to be called. And in this route, we are expecting a value in from the URL, and we are going to hold it in a variable called name. Again, the reason I know this is a variable is because before this word or the string, I have a colon in my root. Okay. Now in here, now you need to pass in two more parameters in this function to create our server, which is request and response. So if you ever need a value from the user, from the URL or the front end, we'll access the request parameter. Else, if we are just displaying something back to them, we'll use the response parameter. In this case, we are expecting the user to provide us some string from the URL. So we'll call request dot params to access that value from our URL. And within square brackets, I'll call that variable by its name. So name, and a semicolon follows. And thereafter, now in response, I can just send back hello and followed by the name that we've stored in this variable. Okay, so whatever is being passed in the URL, I'm storing it in a variable called name. And what you may notice now is that I'm not using single inverted commas, I'm using backticks. Okay, like zoom in. This is what your single inverted commas look like up here. This is what backticks are. The reason I'm using backticks is so that I can print out this variable value in the middle of my response.send function. Okay, so if I want to print out a variable in this format, okay, which is sorry, dollar sign and curly brackets, and then I type out my variable name. If you want to print out a variable in Node.js in the middle of a string, you can use backticks. Backticks is an option that should be on a PC, it should be available to you right above your tab option on the left side of your keyboard. So in response, I'm going to send back hello and the name. Okay, my server is currently not running. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit and select this server.js file and run it. Oh, it is running. Okay. Yes, it is running. I didn't stop it. Yeah, here it is. I see the three dots here. That's all right. So what I'm going to do is now go back to the localhost 3000, and we'll still see if you run your code again, if you run server.js again and you open localhost 3000, you will see hello world because that's our default root. In order to use this new root that we have created, okay, uh, you'll have to type in the URL /name slash whatever name. We have an error, cannot get name slash Jane. Why is okay? The reason being is because the server was up and running and I did not refresh it. I modified my code, but I did not refresh my server. So lesson learned. Now, if I refresh this again, you can see that we see our output hello Jane. If I change it back to hello Mark, okay, then you see that output changes. So the benefit of this is now using your Express.js instance, you've managed to create, first of all, multiple links. We are not just seeing hello world in response. We managed to create another route. And based on a value that is being provided to us in the URL, we are able to print out different outputs in our front end. Okay, so that's how Express.js is useful. And again, if any of this code, if you're not following along, the class code that is provided to you should have all of these roots already in it. And to walk you through it, I have provided this PDF on Blackboard. So what we did so far was created our Express server, okay, ran it on port 3000, saw hello world, our default route. Then we set up this dynamic route, and the explanation around it will help you with it. Okay, so let's see what we have next. We saw our import, how we need to import our modules, how we set up our Express server, what our main route or our default route looks like, and if we are using more routes and we're passing in a parameter in the URL, how we can create that. Next is your route with no parameter. So in our previous example, we saw how we can call the name route and we are passing in a parameter, which is in our case was our name, and we are printing out hello, that person's name. What if you just want to get a specific Pokemon's information? Okay, I'm not sure if that is documented. Yeah, we didn't go over that. There's no example of it, but I'm just going to copy paste it and we'll go over that. But what if you just want a randomized Pokemon to be displayed? Okay, so if you want to create a route and not pass any parameter to it, that's also fine. So first we saw the default route, then we passed in a parameter. And the last way to do it is to just pass in a route. So you go to localhost 3000 Pokemon and have your code already fetch or display some data for you. So that's a sort of different version of how we simply printed out hello world. If you don't want to pass in a specific value to make your page dynamic, show a static page, another static page besides your main home route, then you can also just create more pages, how many ever routes you want, by calling upon your app instance and giving each route its own individual name. And that way you are able to display that information. So right now, as you can see, this is using EJS. So I'm going to skip over this example for just a minute, but let's see if I were to print out response.send hello friend, okay, and save this. Let's refresh our server, okay, our Node.js server, and see how we can access a route besides, okay, server crashed. Okay, it just stopped running. So let's see how we can again access this route and see this output, okay, which is something besides the two routes that we've created, which was our main homepage or the specific URL, which was expecting some value in it. Okay, so let's run server.js. We are getting some error. Here, let's see. What is the error? Address is already in use. what's happening is that it is assuming that I've already am running my code in port 3000, which is why I'm unable to see my output. Let me just try Pokemon. Okay, hello friend is running. Let me zoom out. Okay, it's saying port 3000 is already in use because it's running from elsewhere. I'm going to close. When this happens, I would suggest just closing VS Code, reopening it, and hopefully any servers that were running in any of my VS Code windows have stopped. I'll try to run it again. Okay, and now it's saying port listening on 3000, and that's an error you might face. So what I would recommend is when that happens, if you get a red error that says port 3000 already in use, even though ours wasn't running, in that case just close all of your VS Code windows and then open the folder again and then try running your server.js file. The reason I know currently my code is running is because we are seeing this console log, as well as I can see my refresh stop the server from running and all of these other options. Okay, if I switch back and again refresh, you can see that besides my default root localhost 3000, which said hello world, and besides where I specify an actual person's name, so name root, I can also access my Pokemon root, which shows me hello friend in response for now. Okay, so we didn't quite get into EGS, so I wanted to skip this example because we'll need to address a couple of more concepts before getting there. Lastly, you can see that we went through the modules, the anatomy of Express.js server. In that, we went through the required modules that needed to be installed. We saw the different routes that we created. And the reason this file is running is because just like we did with our server, our Node.js server, even when you're working with Express.js, you need to call the listen function and specify on which port it is running. Now, in this case, you don't need to specify our actual host name. It'll assume that to be localhost by default. However, we do need to specify the port name. So the way to run your code, or what's essential for your code to run once you have imported the necessary modules and created your different routes, is that in order for server.js to run your application, you need to have this line of code at the end where you're calling your Express instance and you're asking it to listen on this port. Once that is up and running, we have this function that's going to just let us know, us developers know, that our port is running, or sorry, our application is running on port 3000. Okay, so the last step of creating your Express.js application is starting your server on the port you specified. Again, if there's a certain range of how you can specify your port number. For now, we've just been using 3000 as a default. Okay, so far so good. I think I should just check with y'all. I know that I think the chat has been disabled, but I'm just hoping everyone's following along. Is there should we stop at any point or review anything again? Can anyone unmute, please?
Even though the chat is disabled, I think we can still type questions in the Q&A.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I enabled that. Again, for whoever joined later, I'm so sorry that we had to switch between Teams and Zoom and not whatnot. Since Blackboard was updated, they kicked out a feature called Blackboard. I don't remember what it was called also. But since then, I haven't really had an online class and wasn't able to figure out the settings. Um, but you will be provided with today's class recording, so I'm hoping that helps a little bit. I'm going to continue. So we saw how we can run our Express.js application and how it made it easier for us to create our different routes. Okay. Now, what EJS is? Express.js allowed us to create these different routes to see our response. But at the end of the day, we will want to style our websites a little better, right? So Node.js, as I said, is a technology used by one of the companies like Airbnb, and their website looks nothing like what ours is right now. So how do we fix that? The way to fix that is by using EGS templating. So EGS templating kind of helps us integrate or create our different pages. So instead of just having all of your outputs up and running from your server.js file, you can create .egs files and display code that's basically like HTML, and we can see how we'll style that using CSS as well. Okay, so the syntax of you creating an EGS file is very similar to that of creating our HTML file. So EGS is a templating engine that can be used with Node.js and other server-side JavaScript environments. It allows you to generate dynamic HTML content on the server by embedding JavaScript code with HTML templates. So what EGS does is with Node.js, it allows us to create HTML templates. We'll see how we can use EGS syntax to display certain values that come from our server, but the structure of our page is basically going to be HTML, which makes it a little easier for us to structure code and style it using CSS. Okay, so in many Express applications, EGS is chosen as the templating engine. So what our basic code that we are using, technology that we are using is Node.js. Along with that, we are using our Express framework. So we are building on it, and that's the different routes that we just saw. But in sort of working hand in hand with Express is often EJS, and that's the templating engine that we'll use today to display a better front end for our pages and not just have a response that's sent in return, okay, from our server. So far, you can see that every time we printed out any of our, I'm going to stop our server, but anytime we created any of our routes or just our default route or anything, we were sending a response and a string back in as a response, right? But we want to do more than that. So for that reason, we have these two folders that I skipped over earlier, which is views and public. Views is going to hold all of your EGS files that again are going to look much like HTML. All right. And public is going to hold all of your files that are not EJS but are necessary for your front end, which is your styles.css, main, sorry, JavaScript, and any other HTML page that you might need. Okay, so we'll see how we can work with this and integrate this in our website, the public folder. We will for now just see how we can create our EGS templates. You can see that the page structure looks a lot like HTML, but in certain places, like over here on line 10, we are using something that's called EGS syntax. So if and when we create our server code to run this, if you're passing some value from your backend, okay, from your client server side to run this page, if you want that value displayed in EGS, okay, this is a variable. If you want to display that in EGS, for example, our title or the heading, in that case, you will use syntax which is much like this, which is you do, I'm going to erase this. You're going to open your pointed brackets, okay, percentage sign equal to, and that's your opening tag. So in HTML, all you did is open a pointed tag and wrote out, sorry, open a pointed bracket and wrote out your tag name. If you're using EGS syntax to print out a variable value, then you're going to use pointed bracket percentage sign equal to. Now type out your variable value, which in this case is Pokemon. Okay, that's what my variable is called. And then to close this EGS syntax, I'm going to use percentage sign and pointed brackets. We no longer need equal to, that only goes in the beginning. Now again, variable is something that we are getting from our server in this example, and it's holding some value for me. Okay, so let's create our root for that and see how we can use this. I'm going to minimize the screen. We went over what our template looks like. Okay, so we before we do use the EJS file, let's see how we can just do it inline if we want to print out some value in order to practice that syntax. Okay, so the same name root, I'm going to go in there, and I think it's in this PDF. EJS file. Okay, So if we want to modify our same name root, but we want to use EGS syntax in it, all I'm going to have to do is firstly install that module. Again, we did do npm install in the beginning of class. If you haven't done it, EGS is a module, is a separate module that we will need to import. So I'm going to type it out. Const EGS equals to require, and you use call out that specific module's name. And to check if it's currently installed in my project folder, I can simply open my folder over here, go into node modules and see if I have EJS. A much easier way to see if I have that installed is to simply go to package.json and see if that's one of my dependencies. It is. If it wasn't, then I would have to open my terminal. So go to terminal, new terminal, and type out npm install EJS. And if I hit this again, it won't do anything. It's already existing, so it'll just uh, go through that line of code. Okay, and again, now that I have that installed, let me see how I can modify this code and use EJS syntax to display my value. So the first thing I'll do is I'll get that parameter name from my URL, and thereafter I'll create a variable called, in this case, let's just call it HTML, as that's what's in our example. And what I'll do is use the EGS module and render a heading of the second order, so H second level. Okay, opening, closing heading. And I'm going to type out welcome the name variable. So welcome and EGS syntax. So if you want to print out this name that's stored in this variable name, I'll use pointed brackets, percentage sign equal to, and I'll type out my variable name, which is name, and I'll close it by just again percentage sign and pointed brackets. All right. And so the difference between what we were doing earlier and now is that earlier we're simply typing out this response send and showing hello name. But now we were able to use some HTML tags to display our user's name that's coming from the URL in a specific way. But we are not done just yet. If you do want to pass this value, this variable name to the front end, you're going to have to specify that variable. Okay, so what is this name? So in our EGS syntax, we are printing something called name. Let's actually change this to first name. Okay, now if you need to specify to the front end what, or to EGS what this first name is, you're going to have to send it. So while you're using EJS.render, not only do you have to send back this HTML with EJS syntax, but you also need to send back that variable name. So first name is actually name. Okay, and where this value is coming from is here. Okay, so we got some value from our URL. We use the request and params functionality to get that value that we were getting from our link. We stored that in this variable called name. Then we are using EJS to render this HTML tag and print out the first name. Now that is not sufficient. You need to pass to the front end information as to what is this first name variable. You'll do that by, again, I'm getting an error because this needs to go in a curly bracket, between curly brackets. So in there, I'm specifying that this first name variable is actually this value that we've stored in the variable called name. And lastly, what you need to do is send that uh, or use this response.send syntax and send back this HTML variable to get rendered. So I'm just going to maximize the screen. And if that was confusing, we'll just go over it again. What we did was, in order to use our EJS syntax inline, okay, so this is our inline example, we imported that module. Once we have access to that, we can use this render functionality to print out our HTML tags. So we use the H2 tags, and now we can display welcome and some variable name. To print out this variable, we use EJS syntax, which is the opening tag is something like pointed bracket, percentage sign equal to. The closing bracket is percentage sign and closed pointed bracket. Between that, you're going to type in your first name, variable name, okay? And then you need to specify where that value is coming from, okay? So first name that we are trying to print out in EJS is actually this requested parameter that we got from our URL. So in response, or again, as I said, whenever you're using your Node.js application, in your at the end of your routes, you need to specify what is the response that you're sending back. So in response, or at the end, what we're sending back is actually this EJS line of code that we have stored in this variable. So, okay, so now someone tries to access the name root, they again need to specify a value in there. And what we're going to see is not a simple response dot send hello name. We are actually going to see an h2 tag. Okay, so I'm going to run this code again, open it in my browser. So localhost 3000 slash name slash mark. And you can see that this looks much different and much better than what it was initially. And it is dynamic. So even if I type in something gibberish, you can see that. Okay, so we've managed to use HTML as a response in our Node.js application. Now I know I kind of switched to again just using the server file, but we did see that we have something called an EJS file under views, right? So let's see that if we don't want to just display an H2, we want a lot more to be showed in our front end. How can we do that? Okay, so how do we render our EJS files? Here, what we did right now was called inline EJS. Okay, so inline templating. EJS templates can be inline or have a dedicated EJS file like we just saw. So inline templates are strings containing HTML code as well as EJS expressions like we just saw. So it has your EJS syntax as well as some HTML code, and it's still beneficial if you just want to print out a tiny line of code, which is like hello and the username that we just saw. But another way to do that is by using these template files. Okay, so EJS template files. Before we get into that, in order for our server.js file to be able to read whatever is inside the views folder, we need to import another module called path. Okay, so right at the beginning, actually, before express and EJS, I'm going to do const path equals to require, and inside the brackets, I'll call path. Okay, so now we will call upon this module anytime we want to read a specific EJS file or even the CSS file, which we'll get to at the end. We'll see how we can read that specific or how we can give server.js access to a specific file. And the way to do that is by using this path module. Okay. Give me a second. So yes, when loading node files in Node.js, the path package is used to get exact paths or exact locations to the file by using this function over here. So path.join, dir name, public, you are basically telling no, server.js that in this current directory that we are in, or wherever this server.js file is, I have a folder called public that you have access to or that you can access. So it's sort of like instructing server.js to go ahead and access this particular folder in our current directory. So in order for server.js to be able to read any of the paths inside our project folder, we are using the path module. Had you not used this, server.js wouldn't be able to read any file, even though it's in the same folder. Server.js code, our server code, would not be able to read these Node.js or EJS files. So for that reason, we need to specify the path. Okay, so let's see how we can create or we can use this EJS file that we have. Let me see if I have that code here. So we saw EJS files. Yes, okay. So we are at the last part of our PDF. Okay, so PDF again, it has detailed instructions. in our PPTs we saw, or even here we can see how we can use EGS templating inline in our server.js code. Now we can use our external EGS file, and let's create a root for that first, and then I'll get into what's inside that file again. Okay, so in server.js, let me minimize this. Let's create a new root. Okay, so right after our homepage root, our name root where we are using inline EGS, our Pokemon root that we have, let's create another dynamic root. What I mean by dynamic is I'll call the app.get instance, and I'll specify that we need a new root called Pokemon. And what we are going to do in this root is use that, firstly, we'll use that external EGS file, okay, to display an entire HTML page. And secondly, what we are going to do is, based on the value that is being provided here, we'll fetch a specific Pokemon's details from the Pokemon API. Okay, so just stay with me. What we need from this URL is to get a specific Pokemon's name from the link. Okay, and we are going to create this function asynchronously, because what we are going to do is we will get a certain Pokemon's value that's specified in the URL. Okay, we'll get it from our external Pokemon API. From your coding challenge 3, we used the Pokemon API briefly, right, with await async. So you know that if we need to fetch any value from an external API somewhere, which in our case is the Pokemon API, you need to use async await. So in that case, when you need to have some value fetched from elsewhere, you need to specify or use the async keyword before creating your function. So in that, because of that, we are using the async keyword here. The next thing that we'll need to do is get the Pokemon's name so that we can send it to the front end. Okay, so name equals again request dot params, and in here we specify that the value or the variable in our URL is called name. Okay, that way whatever the user enters in the URL, we are saving it in a variable called name. Then what we need to do is, using the path module that we just installed, we need to give server.js access to the Pokemon file that we just saw. So under the views folder, we have a file called getpokemon.egs, which has been provided to you. We need to give server.js access to it. So I'll create a variable called HTML again. And because this file is going to fetch some value for us from the Pokemon API, we created a function asynchronously. And now I'm going to use the await keyword and use EGS module to render this external file. Okay. And I need to specify where this file is, where my EGS file is. So the way to do that is by using path.join. Okay, if my prompts are disturbing you, it's available here. This is what we're following. So path.join, and in here, inside rounded brackets, I will use two underscores. Underscore is basically it's right under your, how do I show you? Well, sorry, this is what your single underscore might look like, right? And you need to use that twice and specify that in this directory, in our current directory, we have a file called views, or a folder called views. Inside that, we have an EGS file. I'll go over it again. I'm sorry about the zoomed in and prompt. But inside our views subfolder, I have something called a getpokemon.egs file that I want server.js to have access to. Now, not only do I want this file to get rendered, I also want to pass in that Pokemon name that we fetched from our URL. So part of our work, our server.js is doing for us. We are getting our value from the URL in server.js. Now, in order to get this value from our Pokemon API, when this file is being rendered, I need to pass that variable to it. Okay, so right outside this path.joins rounded brackets, after the rounded brackets have closed, I'm going to enter a comma and then pass in that Pokemon's name. So Pokemon name. Okay, Um, and in response, again, at the end of every route, we need to send back some value or some string or something in response. So in this case, we are sending back the HTML variable. And our code is pretty much ready to run. So let's go over it again. We do have an error here because I forgot to add the comma. Okay, so let's see what we've created so far. We again created a new Express instance, and our root is now called Pokemon. And we are going to specify a Pokemon's name in our root, and we'll store that value in a variable called name. Now, if you're wondering if this variable from our root earlier is also called name, this is also called name. Firstly, they are different roots. Secondly, the parameter is sort of like a placeholder for storing some value. And what the variable name is doesn't matter. What matters is that you have a colon in front of it. So this is our root name. Okay. And because this value or the string called name has a colon in front of it, it signifies that that's going to hold some value that we pass to it, which in this case is going to be the name of our Pokemon. So whatever is passed in our URL, we are using the request parameters functionality to get that value, and we are storing it in a variable called name. Now that we have our Pokemon's name, we are going to send it to the front end. Now, in this case, because we are using Express and EJS, we need to give server.js access to read that EJS file. The way to do that is by calling the EJS module and using its render file function and then telling it where that file exists. So inside the render file function, we currently have two parts to it. Firstly, we are giving our code access to where this EJS file is. Secondly, the second parameter is optional, is that we're passing some value to it. Okay, so if we actually go to our EJS file, you'll see that this file that has been provided to you, again, mostly looks like HTML, but in a few parts, it's using this EJS syntax. So whatever Pokemon name is being passed in our URL, that is going to be printed out as the title of our page using this EJS syntax. We will be printing out an heading of the first level, again using EJS syntax. And lastly, we have this JavaScript code that we are just using for fun. Okay, and it's an API function quite similar to what you must have seen in your coding challenge 3, where we are using an async await function, and we are calling this Pokemon API. And in here, we are passing this variable or this Pokemon whose name we are passing in the URL. So for example, if I were to just Google or search for this API, let's see. Hopefully it loads. In class, it hadn't loaded. But if I were to just search for what this API looks like, okay, you can see that if you actually zoom in, you can see that you have different Pokemon's information. We have, okay, sorry if I mispronounce them, but we have Ivysaur, Charmander, Charizard, and so on. So what we need to do is, we already have access to this Pokemon API. We need to specify in our URL which exact Pokemon we're looking for. So let's say we want to see Snorlax's information. So I'm going to type in Snorlax. And what you see is, it might seem like a lot more, but this is essentially all the information that Poke API has on Snorlax. Okay. So it has different keys and values. And this is what we are trying to leverage or access in our EGS file. So we are trying to access Pokemon API, and we are going to, using EJS syntax, we are going to let the Pokemon API know which Pokemon are users looking for. And then in response, we'll get our JSON file, and that's what we'll print out. Okay. So what's going to happen is that once we get the information from our Pokemon API, we are storing it in a variable called response. Then using DOM, which is your document object manipulation, you're getting this image tag, and we are printing out, or we are getting that image link from our Pokemon API, and that's what we are printing in our front end. So if I search for sprites, okay, let's go back here. Hopefully it's visible. If I search for sprites, you can see that we have, like, for example, this PNG image. Okay, so I provided the function for you to be able to read this specific value or this image, and that's what we are doing over here. Okay, so we are calling our image tag. And of course, if you want, currently we don't have any image set. Okay, if you want to do that, you need to change its source attribute and provide some link to it. So this code, okay, response is coming from our Pokemon API, and we are calling a specific key like sprites front default. So what sprites front default is, so this is back default, you can see. You should also have something like this called front default. So here, yes, this, if we search for Snorlax, this is what gets printed out. Now, this might seem a lot for you to like, it's a lot of random code that's there on our screen. But if you ever want to use any other API with your code, simply just go and read its documentation. I think if we just erase part of this link, a little more perhaps, it takes you to the Poki API website. Okay, just let's click on this. And here you can read documentation that's, well, it's much better written, and you can figure out how you can use the different values that has been provided by this API. So that's exactly what we are doing in our code here. We're simply making a connection with Poki API and passing in our specific Pokemon's name using EGS syntax. And we are using a lot of our asynchronous code from previous weeks, which you don't have to necessarily do in your coding examples. It's just something that I included to make this a little more fun. Okay, and integrate what we just covered in the previous weeks. But what we're essentially doing here is modifying our image tag to display the image of the Pokemon that we're searching for. So coming back to our Express and EJS, we are rendering this file. We are going to display this file when we access our Pokemon root and pass in a value in the URL. Okay, and we are using EGS syntax in multiple places, so not just in the title and the heading, but also to get a specific Pokemon's information from this API. All right, so in server.js, all that server.js is doing for us is it's getting that value that the user is providing from our link. Okay, it's storing it in a variable and rendering our front end for us. Okay, we use the path module to give server.js access to some file that's not in here. It's in the views folder inside our current directory, and the file is called getpokemon.ejs. To this file, we are passing our variable. So EJS file is expecting a variable that's called Pokemon. So we are passing the name that we got from our URL to this Pokemon variable, and that's what gets sent to our front end file. And let's just refresh our server that's running right now. Okay, refresh. And okay, let me open our terminal just to make sure there are no errors. There is some error. Wait, let's see. Something happened again. So I can't quite figure out why we're getting this error today, that it's all port is already in use. We are currently running it, so maybe it was trying to, if because I refreshed it, it was trying to run the code again. So I got an error that the code that you're trying to run is already being run. So if you're already seeing that app is listening on port 3000, or even if you can't see that your code is running, you can always just stop your server. Okay, and regardless, you can close VS Code so your server's ends or your server session ends. Open VS Code again, select your server.js file and run and debug in your Node.js environment. If everything is done correctly, you should see this console log. And the reason we are seeing this console log is because when we have sort of written in our code that once the server is up and running, just console log that, just to notify us as developers. But going back to accessing this route that we've just created, localhost 3000 slash Pokemon slash Snorlax. So what you're seeing here is, again, this is an external, all you're seeing in your URL is the name of the root that we are accessing, as well as the a value that we are passing. And based on this value that we are passing, if I were to change the Pokemon name, you see that the image, the title, and the heading all changes. So there are multiple benefits to using Express and EJS. Firstly, we were able to create multiple routes. We were able to do more than just send a hello world in response. We were able to render an entire HTML page that in parts, of course, to make it dynamic, we used EJS syntax to display our value, and this value again is coming from our server file. And using the EJS module and the Express module, we were able to create this route and render an external file. So even though we were not sending back a response like hello friend like we did earlier, we managed to render an entire page that had no connection with our server.js file. We use the Express instance here. We use the EJS module to render a file, and in order to give server.js access to that file, we use the path module. Okay. And this might be a lot, but it really helps your work as a developer become much easier. Okay. Now, lastly, before we wrap up class for today, um, what if we want to include some CSS to this? So we have styles, we have a file called style.css that we created. Okay, so let's see, we have an h1 tag. Let's go to our public folder, a subfolder. In here we have another subfolder called style.css, and here you can see that our h1 tag, its color should be red. Okay, so we already have some styling for our h1 tag that says our heading of the first level should have its font color should be red. But as you may have seen, our h1 tag is not red, it's the browser default, which is black. So in order for, again, your EJS file to have access to this style.css file, no, the path is not wrong. This is just a file that's being rendered by server.js. So you need to let server.js know that we have some external assets or resources inside our public subfolder, like CSS or JavaScript or HTML we'll get to in the next class. But if you want to access any of this styling, or if server.js wants to give any of the files that are being rendered here access to the CSS file, you need to specify a certain line of code, which is at the end of our PDF. Okay, this. I'm going to copy this, switch back to our tab. But right before we start running our server, I'll paste this line of code, which again calls our Express instance and allows it to use the static file, which is our CSS folder or subfolder under the public folder. So if you want the user to have access to, or if you want the server.js file to give access to your views or your EJS template, if you want your server.js to give your EJS external files access to the CSS styling, you'll have to specify this line of code that says that in Express we have our static files in this root. Okay, so I'm going to save this, refresh, go back to our browser, refresh this page, and you can see that now our heading or h1 tag is red. So the styling that you specify in style.css, you need to mention to server.js that if in case any of our EJS files try to access the CSS styling, this is where you should be able to find it. Okay, so you're basically specifying to your EJS file part of your link to the CSS files over here. And if we go back to pokemon.ejs, you can see that the link to our style sheet is simply slash style.css, is because the rest of our path, this file has access to the rest of our path because we've specified it over here. So if I just let server.js know that use what give your EJS files access to anything that's in the public folder because you want to use maybe JavaScript as well, then in that case, this link will change to CSS. So make sure that when you do give server.js access to some static files, You mentioned, well, all of your static files will go under this public folder and you have a slash. The rest of your link to provide access to that file gets mentioned in your EJS file. So server.js basically gives our EJS template access to static resources. Static as in this won't change. H1 tag will not be red right now and 5 minutes later it won't be pink. Okay, these are static stylings that we mention to our EJS files. So we mention part of our link and we provide access to it over here. And the rest of our path to these specific files we mention over here. Okay, so again, if we save, or if I go to try and change style.css, change the color now to wait, blue, save, refresh my server and go back. Oh, it crashed or something didn't work. Wait, let me see. Save, go back to get pokemon.egs, style.css. Maybe because I changed the part of our code, it didn't work. Let me expand this to see if we have any errors. Nope. I'm just going to stop my server from running in case some changes didn't reflect. Select server.js file, go to my run and debug option and run and debug. Port 3000, refresh my page. Why is this not reflecting? Let me see. I feel like one of the possible issues is that, again, when we did want to give server.js access to our views files, then we did use this path.join function. Let's try using that again, but for our public folder. So if you want to give your server code access to this public file or folder, let's use the path.join function to specify that in this current directory, we have a folder called public, and the rest of our link is in our getpokemon.egs file. So let me refresh our browser again. Go back, refresh this page. And okay, I will get back to you as to why this isn't working, but it should, because if I simply mention part of my code, okay, what I think is maybe this. I forgot to mention that slash. Let me run our server again. So server.js, run and debug. Okay, we have some error. Again, it might be saying that the port is already in use because I try to keep refreshing my code. So I'm going to open VS Code again, try to run server.js, run and debug. And if I go back and refresh, yeah, the issue was, again, if you're mentioning part of your link over here, so public is the subfolder that we are trying to access. But the tiniest of things can cause such an issue that you'll start worrying, why are my styles not reflecting? It was simply because I did not have that forward slash here. So if you're mentioning your path in your EGS templates, you need to have that forward slash and then mention the location of your file. So just because of that, our new heading color wasn't reflecting. So let me try that again. Now let's change this to red. Save. And in order to just run our code again, I think it was saying that the port is already in use. Let me try to refresh this. Okay, it's gone back to red. Okay, so that was all for Express and EJS. Let's quickly take, I know today's class is running a bit too long, but let's take a 10-minute break. So it's 9:50 almost. Let's come back at 10. And the last thing that we'll do is, even if you're not following along, you know that you have been provided with that EGS final folder, right? So lesson plans, class code, lesson 5 class code. So we'll try to host this final folder, which is essentially doing the same thing, all of our same paths that we learned today. We'll try to host this on AWS, okay? So let's take a 10-minute break. At this point, would anyone like to ask any questions or add anything? Are you all awake?
I asked a few questions in the Q&A.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't get notified. Yes. Is double underscore always used for EJS? Do you mean with that directory name?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's sort of the syntax. So if you want to access or basically tell server.js that if this is the current directory, then you need to have the double underscore right before it. Your next question was, do we have to install Express.js every time or it's a one-time installment? No, it's not a one-time installment, kind of, yes and no. So if I'm trying to modify my current project itself and if I need to access or add to this project, it's always going to have that EJS module installed. So, or Express module installed. So in that case, I don't need to go back and forth. And every time I open this project, I don't need to install it. But let's say I'm creating a new project. Okay. Let's say I create a new folder in my downloads. Let's call it portfolio. If I open that portfolio folder in VS Code, so I'm going to open folder, okay, select the folder, that empty folder that I just created. Now in here, this is currently empty. All I'll do is maybe for now create a server.js file, and you can see the rest of my modules are not here yet. What I can do is go to my terminal, open a new terminal, and run. In this case, I will have to install, for this project, I will have to install Express again. And that will automatically create my node modules and package files for me. Same goes for EJS. Okay. You can directly get into using the server.js file and creating your Node.js server, but you will be required to use Express and EJS. In that case, you'll have to go in, create your folder, and install each module like again for the first time only. Once this has already been installed to this project, I don't need to install it again and again because it's already here. Okay, so for the first time, you need to install your modules. Even Path, for that instance, you could have installed, but I think Path is a module that already should be there for us by default. Yeah, there is Path 2. Yeah. Or maybe it comes with a Node.js module the Node.js application that we've already installed, right, in last week. So we already have access to that. EJS and Express, they don't come by default. We need to install them ourselves. So yes, good questions. Um, for using EJS, do we have to use a .html file, even though EJS has a similar structure as HTML? So no, you should, if you're working with an EJS file. So let me open our code from today, the starter file. If you are trying to use if you're trying to use the EJS file under a views folder, so any files that go under your views folder, um, that have that are using EJS syntax, they need to have an EJS extension. Sorry, just give me a second. Yeah, sorry about that. If you are using EJS syntax in any of your files like this, okay, and you are linking them with your server.js file, in that case, they need to go inside views and they need to follow or use this EJS extension. Okay, HTML was just here that in case you ever have a static file that you want to link to your EJS file, this is where you can have it. But in general, I would say that we don't need it. Okay, when you're working with your Node.js applications, just have your EJS file under the views subfolder. I'm sorry, I went a little round and round about it, but I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Right? You're welcome. These were good questions. I'll just give you all a 10-minute break till 10:05. Okay, make sure you have your AWS open and you're logged into it, or you're at least at this page. Okay, let's resume. Can you all hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, thank you. Um, let's head on to AWS. So if you just search for AWS, maybe Elastic Beanstalk login, that should take you, or that should redirect you to AWS's services. And Elastic Beanstalk is essentially what we will be using to deploy our web applications. Um, you can, you should be able to sign into your AWS account, right? So I'm going to get into using I'm going to select the root user option, enter my email address, okay, and hit next, enter my password. I do have multi-factor authentication, so you might not have it, and that's completely okay. It is it is more secure, just a little tedious. I'm just going to enter my code. So 906. Okay, if you don't have multi-factor authentication, completely fine. Email and password is more than sufficient. This is what your main console might look like. Okay, so even if you're not here, but as long as you're logged into AWS, okay, you should have a search bar right on top. In here, just search for Elastic Beanstalk, okay, and click on that. And this is where we will be hosting our application. Couple of quick notes. On AWS, if you try to access any of their other services, they have many, there is a possibility that you will get charged. So I had a scenario in the previous semester where a student got charged because they went on to explore, I think, the blockchain module or something. Definitely remember that only Elastic Beanstalk is free when you're trying to host one application at a time, and that's only up till a year. Thereafter, if you try to host multiple applications, or a year later, if you try to host an application, it is possible that you will get charged. So make sure you're trying. The reason we are including this and not using any other module is because Humber is not providing us access to any hosting service. Not free hosting service, unfortunately, we're not there yet. So we will use AWS because it's something that's used in the industry pretty widely. So great learning experience. But be very careful with, like, if you're trying to sign up or use a particular service, just make sure you're not spending money on it unless, of course, you want to. Okay, so again, just have one application hosted at a time. So for example, if your today's coding challenge will be, you'll need to host it. So in that case, just one, if you're following along right now, I'll show you how you can delete the application that's currently running, and then you can host another application. So let's go ahead and start creating our first application. Okay, so before we get on to using this, what you might need to do is, in the same search bar, search for IAM. Okay, IAM, and click on this. So this basically helps us create different resource management roles that we'll do right now. So I'm going to search for IAM on top over here, go to roles. Okay, and this might be empty for you right now, completely okay. What I'm going to do is, on here, I'm going to select the create role option to create a new role, and select everything by default. The use case is going to be EC2. Okay. In case you're not there yet, I'll just go take a step back, actually, in case I was too fast. What I did was search for IAM, okay, in my search bar up here, and that took me to this page. On here, I selected the roles tab on the left side of my page, and I clicked on this create role option to create a new role. In here, again, most of the things we are going to do is selected by default. Just two places where we'll select an option is, firstly, in here, choose the service to be EC2. Okay, and then leave the rest. Click the next button at the bottom of your screen. And now what's going to happen here is you need to select policies that your AWS account can use when they're trying to like certain policies as to what kind of applications they can deploy and so on. So I'm going to search for the word deploy. So that gives us most of our permissions. So yes, this policy right here, AWS code deploy role for ECS, I'm going to select that, as well as the one after it that says ECS limited. Okay, if you're concerned about following along, all of these steps are mentioned on the last slide of the PPT. Okay, and also I think in today's class's supplemental resources, it should be available. But this step that we're doing right now is sort of just because we're doing it for the first time, you won't have to do it again and again. We need to create roles that our AWS application can access. If they're basically policies that our application has access to and rules as to what you can use in order to host our application. So to identify the number of policies we've chosen here, just give this role a name. So I'm just going to call it AWS MMDD209. You can call it just AWS role. And once I have given this role a name, again, if I'm going too fast or something, you missed on something, just unmute and let me know, please. Okay, I'm going to create role by scrolling to the bottom of the page. And it's going to take a second, but that role should get created for me. Okay, so my role's right here. Now I'm going to go back to the search bar and search for Elastic Beanstalk and go back here to just host our application. Okay, so going back here, you'll see that if you there is a console or there are tabs on the left where you can see your current applications that are being hosted on Elastic Beanstalk. So if I click on there, currently we have none. So we will create an application and it will prompt us thereafter to create an environment as well inside which our application can run. So let's go ahead and create our first application. The file that we need to upload here eventually, let's prep that. So from today's class code that we worked on, I'm going to select all of these files. Okay, so this is the file. These are the files we worked on today, right? The Pokemon and all of that. So I'm selecting all of these files and then right clicking on it to compress it. Now, this is an important step. You need to make sure you're selecting all of the files that you want to zip and then zip it directly. You don't want to select this folder and then zip it. Because what happens is when you do try to zip a folder, if I try to double click and see, inside this folder right now, I have a subfolder that has gotten zipped, and therein I have my code, right? We don't want that. Okay, you want to select all of your files, then right click on it and compress it. And when you do that, and when I double clicked on my server zipped folder, you can see that all of my files are directly under it. Okay, so this can be a very easy mistake that you try to zip the folder, but you don't want to do that. You want to select the files that you want to host and then compress that into a zipped folder. Okay, so this is what we are going to host. I'm going to just rename it for our convenience to deploy version. Okay, in your final code from today's class, right? If I just show you today's class code, um, inside the final folder, you should already have this zip folder called deploy version. So if you just want to practice along, you can upload this when the time comes. I just zipped in the similar manner. I just created this folder. Again, deploy version, I've just named it for our convenience. It doesn't need to follow that naming syntax, but you just need to make sure you're zipping the files directly. Okay. Coming back to AWS, in here we have no applications that we've hosted. So let's create one by clicking on the create application button. Here you're going to have to give your application a name. So I'm going to call it Pokemon for now. It can be whatever you want it to be. Um, and if it needs to be a single word or shouldn't have any space, if ever, then AWS will prompt you. So just follow those instructions. Yeah, so I'm going to go. There are going to be a couple of steps that we'll need to go through. So we did create our application Pokemon, but now it's asking us to create an environment that our app can run in. Okay, so it should take you to this console. On here, you'll click the create new environment button. So our application we'll set up our Node.js environment for our code to run. So when you do click on create environment, you'll see that there are 6 steps that we just need to go through. A couple of things to change here. Most of the things will just remain default. But in step 1, if you scroll down, there is a section where you need to choose the platform. On here, just use the drop down and select Node.js. Okay, so in step 1, what we do need to select is Node.js. Once you do select the platform, it will automatically select the latest versions, which we are working with the latest version, so no modifications required. And thereafter, you can either use sample application, but we won't do that. We'll directly go and select the upload your code option. And there is an option to upload your local file. So I'll select that. And when you're selecting this folder, now you'll choose the zip folder that we just created. Okay, so mine's called deploy version. I'm going to double click on that and upload it here. So again, in step 1, you just chose the Node.js platform and the zip folder of your code. Okay, the rest in step 1 remains to be a default, whatever AWS's setting is. Make sure you're using this free tier single instance. Okay, again, it's supposed to be selected by default. Let's go to step 2. I'm going to hit next. Oh, yeah. It's telling me that I can't proceed without labeling which version of code this is. I'm going to call it, actually, I'll call it Pokemon underscore V1, which is just my preference. You can simply call it V1, and I'll hit next, which should take us to step 2. Now here we'll select the role that we just created. So if you use the drop down, you should be able to see the role, whatever naming you just gave it. Mine was called AWS MMDD209. Because I had created these roles earlier, you might see some of these other extra roles. I'm simply going to select AWS MMDD209, which is what I just created. I'll do that under the first drop down and the last. Okay, the middle one, you don't need to choose anything. So the existing service roles, we are selecting the role that we just created, as well as for the EC2 instance profile. That's all for step 2. I'm going to hit next. Okay, here we don't need to choose anything. Step 3 and 4, just let it be default, skip over it. In step 5, okay, so 3 and 4, we did nothing. In the first step, we uploaded our code and chose Node.js platform. Second step, we chose the roles that we just created. We don't need to create those roles again. For your upcoming applications, you can reuse them, all right? Step 3 and 4, let everything be default. And now we're on to step 5. And here, all you need to do is scroll right at the bottom and specify the environment properties. So what port is our application running on? So we'll click the add environment property button and specify that the name is port and the value is going to be 3000. Okay, so we're specifying in our case that our application needs to be running on port 3000. And this is a value that AWS will use to run our code. We won't necessarily see it. Okay. That's all for step 5, and that's pretty much it. Just hit next. And the last step is to review. So we chose proper, this is our code, this is the name. We chose Node.js platform. And then in step 2, we chose these roles, these service roles. Step 3 and 4 is all default. Step 5, all we did is specify the port number. Once this is done, you're done with all of your 5 steps. Step 6 is review. We're done reviewing it. So I'm going to hit submit. And this is going to take about 5 minutes to have our code available and running. You can see the status of your code being hosted here at the bottom. Okay, so if again we go back to our applications on the left side panel, you click on Pokemon, it will show you that these are the environments for the app that you're currently trying to host. In here, under events, you can see the current status of your application being hosted. It can take 5 to 10 minutes sometimes. But at this point, does anyone have any questions, or did you miss out on any of the steps?
Will you be uploading the zip deploy folder?
Oh, it's already available to you. So, as I said, inside the class code that's provided on Blackboard, right? Lesson 5 class code is today's. Under the finals folder, you have two folders. This is the beginning version of your file of today's code, and this is our final product. In here, there's already a deploy version zip folder. If you want to directly upload this, you can do that. Let me just check. Blackboard lectures week 5. Yeah, this lesson 5 class code, if you download this, it should be available to you. Yeah, any other documentation to help is also there under supplemental resources. Let's go back, and it's saying this might take a few minutes. You can see that it's still pending, but our domain is ready. If you click on it, okay, it's working. So our code is running successfully. We have hosted our website. It's no longer saying pending and blank. A URL is available to us. If I go on here, this is the link to my website. On here now, I can try to access my different routes. So we know that one of our routes was Pokemon/Snorlax. Oh, I misspelled it. Sorry. Snorlax. It's not giving me any image because Snorlax is misspelled. But let me try typing it correct. And you can see that now on AWS, on our AWS website that's hosted online, we are able to access these different routes that we had created. If I remove this name route and the Pokemon name and just see what's there by default, we are seeing our main route that simply said hello world. So that was it for today's class. Is everyone's website, does anyone face any issues with hosting their website on AWS? I am going to take that as a no, that there were no issues. If during the week with hosting or anything you're facing any issues, please message me and we can try to resolve it over messages, or we can create a meeting. Okay. Real quick note is if you are following along, as I said, you can only host one application at a time. So when you do choose to host one of your assignments or coding challenges, you want to remove the previous existing application that you have. So you go to this applications panel on the left, okay? Select the application that you want to delete, and under actions, you should have an option to delete this application. Just type in the environment name. So if you want to proceed, type in this name. Oh, sorry, you need to delete Pokemon. So you need to type in the application name. When you do so, hit delete, and that in some time, you'll see that this goes away automatically. So when that happens, you can host a new application again by using the same process. And this recording should be available to you. Again, all you need to do henceforth is create an application here. You don't need to go to IAM to create the roles that we did once. Okay. Because we're running out of time a little bit, I'm quickly going to get into today's coding challenge. Assessments, code challenges, code challenge 5. You have a bit of creative freedom with today's coding challenge, which is you have to create your own portfolio, real quick page, but using EJS and Express like we did today. Okay, so read the instructions and let me know if you have any questions with that. But essentially, what you can do is refer to this code that we worked on today and use the same format to display this your portfolio in using this EJS syntax. Okay, so try to refer to this code that we used today, create the necessary routes to display your EJS page. Okay, here we did this pass in some variable to render this EJS file, but you don't necessarily need to do that. So just refer to today's recordings and class code and PDF and try to create your own portfolio site using Express and EJS. Okay, so this holds 6% of your total weightage. And you will need to host this website on AWS like we did with our class code. Okay, any questions? your portfolio site will just need to have, so for this exercise, you just need to have a home page that has a couple of sections, okay? And call to action means there should be a button that redirects me somewhere. Okay, perhaps you could create different EGS files, and when I click on one button, it takes me to a different EGS page or a different EGS route. If not, you can just have a button that, like a contact me button. So, does anyone have any questions? Else we can end today's session. I really appreciate you all sticking along with all the back and forth between platforms, and I'm so sorry for that being so inconvenient. But if there are no questions, then that was all for class today. I'll upload the recording by the end of today. And thank you. I'll see you all next week in person on campus.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. All the best.